All right, so let's take a little look at these numbers from Brightline Florida's monthly revenue and ridership report from April 2024. Many times in marketing opportunity analysis, or as a marketing expert or a marketing professional, you're asked to take a look at a set of numbers to see how those numbers look and to see what those numbers are trying to tell us. Remember that every time we look at a set of numbers, those numbers are trying to tell us something. Many times it's a very positive story about the business. Sometimes it's a very negative story about the business. And sometimes, and most of the times, it's something somewhat in between. So let's take a look at those Brightline ridership numbers from April 2024. Probably the most important skill for any business person is the ability to figure out what the numbers mean and what they're trying to tell you. We talk a lot about storytelling in marketing. The real storytelling comes from data. And it's in being able to understand data. Not all data is numbers either. There's all kinds of different data. But looking at data and understanding the story that that data is trying to tell you. This skill does not require great math ability, but it does take some effort of being able to analyze data, sit down and look at data, and knowledge of how numbers fit together. This is a skill that you acquire over time. There's a famous old quote, figures don't lie, but liars figure. And it's been attributed to a number of people, including Mark Twain and Carol D. Wright, one of the original Department of Commerce U.S. statisticians. And it's sort of funny because there's a dispute over who first said it. But that seems appropriate since the actual quote is, figures don't lie, but liars figure. All right, so here are Brightline's presentation of their results. They had a 5 or 6 page report, and on the very first page of the report, here is the presentation of their April ridership. Brightline Florida is a privately owned passenger rail system comprising 235 miles of track connecting Miami and Orlando, Florida, with additional stations located downtown centers of Aventura, Fort Lauderdale, Boca Raton, and West Palm Beach. Okay, and so here are their April numbers. Ridership up 48%. Total revenues up 209% since last year. And on-time performance at 94%. These numbers look fantastic. It looks like this company is a high flyer. The rest of their numbers that they report also on that very first page are a little bit more detailed. That is, April ridership was up 48% over year over year, and that is up to 223,117 passengers in April, with total revenues up 209% to $15.2 million over last year, so far this year. Total revenue per passenger was $68.20, an increase of 109% over last year. So here are 3 pieces of data. Ridership is up by 48%. Total revenues per passenger is up 109%. And total revenues are then up 209%. Okay? And so then they have some other little highlights that they present. When you see these numbers, you have to say that Brightline is correctly named because their future is so bright they need sunglasses. Their future is bright for Brightline. Well, maybe. What do I mean when I say, well, maybe? Well, never take numbers at face value. That is, when you see a set of numbers, it doesn't mean the numbers are wrong or the numbers are fudged or anything like that. But there are some things about numbers that you always need to be aware of. First, always double check percentages since they are calculated using previous numbers. And percentages oftentimes don't match up because of absolute data and absolute numbers. For instance, if I'm running a Kool-Aid stand and I say I doubled my sales from Monday to Tuesday from $5 to $10, it is a 100% increase, but it's only $5. On the other hand, if I'm a business that increases my sales from 5 billion to 10 billion, well, that's also a 100% increase. But that increase from 5 billion to 10 billion is a $5 billion increase. So we need to look at percentages, but we also need to look at the absolute numbers. Remember that in many cases when we calculate percentages, we're going from year to year or from period to period. And we recently just had the pandemic. And when we had the pandemic, a lot of revenues for companies were way down in 2020, but then they did bounce back somewhat in 2021 and 2022. And if you compare them to 2020, they look fabulous, but in many cases they were just getting back to where they were prior to the pandemic. A lot of that happened with the data surrounding visitation here in Las Vegas, for example. In this case, all the figures that are presented are accurate, but perhaps misleading. Actually, I think that they're not, I think they're not inaccurate at all, but they are rather misleading. So let me just show you what I mean. All right. To go along with this, there are a couple of pieces of information before we start looking at this data that we need to understand. One is that they have two different rail routes. One of the rail routes is what are called short distance customers and short distance routes. These are routes that go between the southeast coast of Florida cities. These are passengers that go between Fort Lauderdale, Miami, Boca Raton, and those stops along the eastern seaboard. Most of the people who take those trains are residents, and they use that train as basic transportation. That is very different from the customers that are using the long distance Brightline services. The long distance Brightline services are the services that go between Orlando and those southeast Florida cities. And most of the people, or at least many of the people riding the long distance lines, will be tourists rather than residents. They are very different users with different levels of price sensitivity and different tolerances for price changes and shifts in pricing. So, first things first. So we're looking at April 2024 data, okay? Well, something important happened in September of 2023. That is, in September 2023, Brightline started its rail service connecting Orlando to the southeast coast of Florida. This long-distance tickets comprise the majority of their revenues and are projected to drive the majority of their earnings growth over time. Long-distance results have been strong and accelerating, with 796,016 customers taking their long-distance service since it opened in September of 2023 through April of 2024. Now, that's an important thing to realize. That is that they have opened a new part of their business since April of 2023. And they also note that they are that with this particular part of their line, this is the line that connects those what we call port cities or east or seaboard cities with Orlando, which of course is one of Florida's major tourist destinations. They have co-marketing partnerships with Royal Caribbean, Celebrity, and Princess Cruise Lines, with several others in discussion. So they have a deal set up so that people who are taking the cruises on the ocean can either get to those cruises or get from those cruises to Orlando to visit perhaps Disneyland or Epcot Center, someplace in Epcot Center, and then get back to their ships to return to wherever those cruises came from. There are approximately 2.3 million cruises taken annually by Florida residents that travel on as many as 65 different ships out of the primary cruise ports of Canaveral, Everglades, and Port Miami. And so there is a deal that Brightline has set with some of these cruise lines to move their people from the coast to Orlando and Orlando back to the coast. Now, let's take a closer look at these numbers. In this case, one of the problems with these numbers is that they are comparing apples to oranges. And you've probably heard that term before. You can't compare apples and oranges because while they're both fruit, they're very different kinds of fruit. More accurately, this is really sort of comparing apples to apples and oranges. And that is because in April of 2023, they only had short distance routes. And now they have both short distance routes and long distance routes. So the data is not really comparable to say, let's compare April of 2023 with April of 2024 because they have dramatically more routes available. So now, understanding that, let's take a look at the data that they provide. Now, this is the rest of the data. You saw the original data. The original data was a 48% increase in ridership, a 209% increase in revenues, and an increase in fares. But here's that actual data that goes with this. Now, this data wasn't hidden. This data is in plain sight in the report, but it's on the very last page of the report. And of course, you need to look at this data and analyze this data because it tells a very different story than the one that you saw on the first page of this report. This data breaks down ridership, revenues, and fare prices by routes. And you'll notice here on the left-hand side, we now have short distance routes, which are those routes between the cities on the eastern coast, and then long distance routes, which are routes between those cities and Orlando. And then we have ridership for short distance and long distance, average fares for short distance and long distance. And of course, we understand that long distance fares are going to be higher than short distance fares because it's a longer distance. Just like, air travel to Europe is more expensive than air travel from here to Reno. And then there are ticket revenues, short distance revenue totals, and long distance revenue totals. And on this one little sheet here and one little table that's in the very last page of the report, this shows some really, really important data as to how things are going for Brightline. Let's start by looking at the ridership for the short-term existing lines. Okay, with the purple lines here, I have highlighted the ridership from 2023 for April from 2023 to 2024. So in 2023, there was 151,000 people who took the short distance lines up and down the coast. In 2024, there was only 103,000 people, 103,737 people who took those same routes. This is a reduction of 31%. That is 31% fewer customers took these routes in 2024 than in 2023. And if we look at the data from year to date, it's the data that is noted by the green arrows. So far in April, in the first 4 months of 2024, we have had almost 500,000 passengers, right? 456,000 passengers. But a year ago, we had 638,000 passengers. That's a reduction of 29%. So ridership for April 2024 compared to 2023 is down by 31%. And for the year, it's down 29%. This isn't down 5% or 10% or something like that, but 29%. Brightline addresses this with a statement, and the statement says April 2024 short distance trips were 103,737 compared to 151,000 in April of 2023 due to capacity limits. And so their argument is that one of the reasons that these numbers are down is because they didn't have enough capacity on their trains. Now, it's hard to determine exactly how accurate that statement is, but they have been anticipating the opening of this long distance route between Orlando and these cities for 7 years. They have operated since 2017, they have operated the short distance routes. And so they've been waiting for 7 years to open this route to Orlando. And then they open this route to Orlando, and their contention is that they now have capacity limits. That may be true, but if it is, it suggests to me that that's sort of really almost shameful planning at a minimum, or perhaps something else is going on. Okay, so now let's take a look at the fares and the revenues for that short-term existing lines, okay? So in 2024, Brightline significantly raised their prices for their short-distance fares by 30%. And in April, they were actually up by 47%. You can see the April numbers once again in purple with the purple arrows, where the average fare went from $23 to $34. That's a 47% increase in April. And year to date, on the average, they've gone up 30% from $24 to $31. Now, why is this important? Well, for regular daily riders that would be using the train for basic transportation, they are likely to be more price sensitive. And so as a result, when you raise those fares, they are less likely to take that train. Now, it turns out that there is other rail service that goes to those cities, and it's a little slower, or it's dramatically slower, but it's only $8. So there are less expensive options, and of course, there is no doubt by looking at these numbers that some of these customers were price sensitive. When we take a look at the revenues, I have the revenues here in blue. We take a look at the revenues for the short distance routes. The revenues were up 1% in April. That's partially due to the 47% increase in fares, but they're down 7% year to date. So for their short distance lines, their revenues are down 7%. Their ridership is down 29% for the year. Those are important numbers because those are comparing apples to apples. So over this last year, their ridership is down by 29%, and their revenues on that part of their line is down by 7%. This certainly suggests that many of the passengers riding the short-term line are price sensitive and are shifting to different forms of transportation. Well, okay, then what about Florida's Brightline long distance service? Okay, and once again, we have this data separated out. All right, and so when I said before that we were comparing apples and oranges, or apples to apples and oranges, when we looked at those original numbers that looked so rosy, it was comparing the short-term results from a year ago with the short-term and long-term results this year. When you compare short-term results from last year to short-term results this year, they're actually negative. The ridership is down, revenues are down. Of course, fares are up. So let's take a look at their long-distance service. So I put a little bit of a different table together for the long distance service. Since there are no comparisons from year to year for us to look at because there was no long distance service last April, the best way to look at this is probably to compare their ridership to their forecasted ridership. Their forecast was for 2.8 million riders to and from Orlando. Given their current numbers, they will have ridership of just over half of that original forecast. And so let's take just a quick look at the long distance ridership. So the long distance ridership for April was 500,000 people going to and from Orlando, 489,855. But their forecast for the year was 2,800,000. So their forecast was 2.8 million, and if their trend continues, their ridership trend from Orlando to the cities on the coast continues, they will end up with a total of about 1.47 million people. Okay, which is only 53% of what they had forecasted. So they're down 47%. So their ridership on their short-term lines is down 49% compared to their estimate, compared to their forecast. And the ridership on their long-distance lines is 47% less than they had forecasted. And so their total ridership is down 48% compared to their forecast. Now, you can say that their forecasts were way too optimistic. You can say that. But once again, they were their forecast. No one else made those forecasts for them. These were their forecasts. So they are going to miss their forecasted ridership by nearly 50%. So, in summary, it is true that total ridership on the Brightline Florida line is up by 48%, and that total revenues are up by 209%. But the fact is that their short-term line riderships and revenues are down, and their long-term riderships and revenues are only half of what they had originally forecasted. So, while we can say great numbers, 48%, 209%, 94% on-time performance, the fact is, from a financial perspective, Brightline Florida is still quite a ways from reaching their goal.